Robert Fisk is a veteran war correspondent, one of the world's most experienced journalists in the Middle East. He's reported from across the Arab world for the past 30 years. He was in Iraq in the 80s during the Iran-Iraq War, in the early 90s during the Persian Gulf War, and most recently during the U.S. invasion and occupation. He's also reported on civil wars in Algeria and Lebanon, the Iranian Revolution, the Russian invasion of Afghanistan, and Israel's occupation of Gaza and the West Bank. Robert Fisk joins me here in our Firehouse studio for the hour. Welcome to Democracy Now!
You're making me feel old, Amy. All these talks of all the civil wars I've covered, I'm beginning to think it's time I packed it all in.
Well, congratulations also on your 2006 Lannan Lifetime Achievement Prize for Cultural Freedom.
Thanks very much indeed. Yeah.
You said last night at a large event at Town Hall in New York, where you were honored and you spoke, that you consider the award important as a flak jacket. Explain.
Well, if you report the Middle East and you do it fairly and honorably and you criticize everyone, and that includes Israel, you're going to get the sticks and stones, sometimes literally. You get a lot of flack. And when a journalist gets an honor like the Lannan Award or a journalistic award in Britain, okay, it's flattering, it's nice, all journalists like that, but particularly in the Middle East, it's a way of showing that there are other people in the West who say, you're doing the right job, keep it up. And it's also a lesson to those critics, particularly the particularly venomous ones, and you and I could think of them straight away, who try to destroy your career by lying about you, by accusing you of being anti-Semitic, anti-Arab, you name it. It's a way of saying, well, hold on a second, look at this list of awards. Do you think these people are all the same? Do you not realize that this was for some reason? So it is a flak jacket. It's a protection for journalists when we get awards for reporting the Middle East, particularly the Middle East.
Robert Fisk, your last piece is about bin Laden hitting 50.
Yes. Well, I must say I did sort of mention in the same piece that I think bin Laden is pretty irrelevant now. You know, his creation is al-Qaeda, and it exists. It's in being. The monster is born. Chasing bin Laden now, if indeed we are chasing bin Laden now, is a bit like chasing nuclear scientists and arresting them all after the invention of the atom bomb. The atom bomb exists. You can't deconstruct it. So arresting the nuclear scientists won't do you any good. And in a sense, you see, the same applies with bin Laden. His achievement, I put that in quotation marks in his eyes, is the creation of al-Qaeda. Never before have we had a violent institution of this kind. And the only way to overcome it is to produce some justice, which, of course, we don't want to do. We want more and more violence against al-Qaeda, which, of course, helps al-Qaeda. But the fact of the matter is that I think bin Laden has achieved in his mind what he wants. And now if he dies of kidney failure, which I don't think he's going to do, I don't believe these stories, or whether he falls off a cliff or gets bombed or arrested, I think it's irrelevant, totally irrelevant.
Talk about your interviews with Osama bin Laden. How many did you do?
I did 3.
Talk about the first one.
The first one was in Sudan. A Saudi friend of his who'd fought with him against the Soviets in Afghanistan, whom I knew, he was now a journalist. He met me at an Islamic conference in Khartoum, and one Sunday morning he said, Robert, I want you to come and meet someone. And for him it was a bit of a joke. He knew bin Laden was out in the desert, where bin Laden's construction teams, he was of course in the construction business, as most of his family were, had been building a new road from a little village to the main highway between Port Sudan and Khartoum to link up so that the villagers could take part in the national economy.
Bin Laden's father was a great Yemeni magnate, construction magnate in Saudi Arabia.
A billionaire, so yes. And indeed, most of Osama bin Laden's money came from the construction business. He built the roads upon which the Afghan guerrillas took tanks to fight the Russians. I mean, I actually went in an air raid shelter, 25 feet high, built into the living rock of a mountain in Afghanistan, built by bin Laden during the Russian war, next to a camp built by the CIA, of course. But no, I went out with this guy. We went across the desert past pyramids you've never seen before. I mean, not even in guidebooks. And we ended up in this desert village, and there was this man, this long white robe, with all these kids dancing in front of him and people slaughtering chickens and goats and sheep. And my journalist friend, who knew bin Laden well, went up and spoke to him in his ear, and I saw bin Laden's eyes flick towards me with palpable concern. He'd never met a Western journalist before. And I was then invited to meet him. I shook hands with him, and he thought I was going to ask him about terror, because he was already being implicated. There were comments by State Department officials that bin Laden was plotting world terror.
This is 1993.
Yes, pretty accurate, actually, if you think about it. But anyway, that's what was happening. So anyway, I wasn't really interested in this. You know, my colleagues had written all this terror stuff. I wanted to know what created bin Laden during the war with the Russians, what happened to him. Because, you know, the Saudis wanted to send a Saudi prince to lead an Arab legion against the Soviet infidels. Unfortunately, the Saudi princes were keener on, you know, living in Monte Carlo than going to Afghanistan, and bin Laden was the man who led the Arab legion. So I said to him, what was it like fighting the Russians? Tell me about fighting the Russians. And he talked for some time about the large number of his supporters. There wasn't an al-Qaeda in existence then. A large number of Arab fighters who died. There's a mass grave near Jalalabad. He told me exactly where it was, with hundreds of his own fighters buried in. And then he recalled an attack on a Russian firebase, a Russian artillery position in Nangarhar province, capital is Jalalabad. And he said, as we were advancing, a mortar shell fell at my feet. And he waited for it to explode and kill him. And he said, I felt sakina, a calmness. It's a religious idea that you are not worried about death. You're outside this world. You are linked in with God and the idea of another world, another life. And the mortar shell didn't explode. There must be many people who wished it had, but it didn't. And obviously, it was quite clear talking to him that this was a very important moment in his life. He'd conquered fear and the fear of death. And once you do that, you start discovering perhaps that you love death, that it's not the same. You remember the famous phrase we always hear from suicide bombers, you love life, we love death, which is the most frightening thing you can hear. And I think that moment, during that attack on the Russians, I mean, it was a Soviet base, a Soviet army base, I think that must have changed him in some way. But, you know, as I saw him each time, he changed too. I mean, he was growing older.
You're older than him.
Yeah, I'm about 10 years older than him. Yes, that's right. I don't think, I mean, we never discussed age, but I mean, he must have guessed I was slightly older than him. He was always very courteous towards me. I mean, he was always, and when he stopped to eat, I would sit on the ground with the Al-Qaeda fighters and eat, you know, yogurt and drink tea with them. He broke off occasionally to pray as well, which I, of course, didn't do with him. But certainly the next time I met him in Afghanistan, he was a much more angry man. He was filled with fury at the corruption of the Saudi royal family. He went into great detail on how many millions of dollars is stolen on this occasion, how many princes had taken these dollars, and so on. And it looked at that stage as if what he really wanted to do was to overthrow the Saudi royal family and become, I don't know, Caliph of Arabia. He didn't say that, but I suspect. I mean, Arabia is what he's interested in. At the end of the day, it's Arabia. Not because of oil, but because of the holy places of Mecca and Medina and his own religious Salafi beliefs. But he was already beginning to talk about people having dreams. You know, in the Wahhabi sect, people believe in what I call dreamology. They think that when they have a dream, it's a message coming from somewhere outside the world. Obviously, you know, if you can interpret the Prophet Muhammad's receiving the message of God as being in a kind of trance or a dream. Remember, the first message he received, he talked about how he was wrapped in he was felt tight, an angel wrapped him and squeezed him tight. And I think that bin Laden believes in dreams. I think a lot of Al-Qaeda people do. They have ideas that come to them. We don't. We believe that this is an inactive but still living brain ticking over. Just things come through like stars pass through the heavens. But I think they interpret them and want to interpret them, which is something we basically gave up in the Middle Ages in Europe.
We have to break, but when we come back, tell us what he told you in that mountaintop in Afghanistan. We're talking to Robert Fisk, the veteran war correspondent. His latest book is called The Great War for Civilization, The Conquest of the Middle East. Robert, you're talking about mountaintop in Afghanistan with Osama bin Laden.
Well, the last time I saw him, which was '97, he did want to see me after 9/11, but I couldn't reach him. An American air raid was on the road in front of me on my way to see him. But the last time I saw him, he'd moved from his hatred of the Saudis, which was still there, into a quite clear fury at the United States. He was starting to talk about them as being crusaders. And in fact, the last words he said to me, as we sat in a very freezing mountaintop, I spent the night with his Al-Qaeda people in a tent sleeping. I woke up with ice in my hair. And the last words he said to me, and I have my notebooks, which of course I will research for this book, and his words were, Mr. Robert, from this mountain upon which we're sitting, we destroyed the Soviet army and helped to destroy the Soviet Union, which was an element of truth, though obviously a usual bin Laden exaggeration. And then he